My name is Stephen Bell. I have a lifelong interest in Ethiopia, and I've also taken a hand in all sorts of campaigns on behalf of Ethiopia, particularly in connection with the restoration to Ethiopia of cultural treasure looted in the course of her history, both by the British in the middle of the 19th century at the time of the MAGDALA campaign, and in the case of Italy more recently in the 20th century.
How did you get involved with organizations such as Afromet that want to preserve or to recover Ethiopian artifacts that have been taken from MAGDALA, for instance?
Yes. Well, one of my main interests was actually the 1868 expedition. It's a most extraordinary story of how it happened, and extraordinary expedition itself altogether. And one of the main historical repercussions of the 1868 Napier campaign to Magdala was the looting of the library at Magdala, when after the victory all the library was ransacked, and a lot of the manuscripts, particularly the very finely, beautifully illuminated manuscripts, eventually ended up being snapped up by the British Library, the British Museum, because accompanying the expedition was a certain Richard Holmes, who had a huge sum of money with which to purchase Ethiopian antiquities for the British Museum. And that's how they ended up there. And this, I consider this to be nothing less than outright theft. And I have assisted very eminent people such as Richard Pankhurst and other Ethiopian historians in the drive to have these restored to Ethiopia, along with other relics taken by the Italians later on during the Italian invasion and occupation in the 1930s. And I played a role in advancing this cause. Unfortunately, as far as the British Museum manuscripts go, they're still in the hands of the British Museum, or rather now the British Library, because the British Library is separated from the British Museum and took over the Ethiopian holdings, and they're still there.
What was your involvement in specific items?
Right. Yes, I have been. I've been involved in one particular thing, which is the painting known as the Kurata Resu. That means in Giz the striking of his head. It refers to a passage in the Bible in St. Matthew and also in St. Mark, where just before Christ's crucifixion he was beaten on the head, he was struck on the head as part of the punishment. And the Kurata Resu was a painting that disappeared very mysteriously from Magdala. Very little was known about the painting, but it was a painting that had played an important and long role in Ethiopian history through the preceding centuries. It was, for example, it was a token of royalty. You had to swear loyalty to the emperor in the presence and in the name of the Kurata Resu. The Kurata Resu was also taken into battle at the head of the emperor's army as a guarantee of victory, and it was possibly the most valued and revered item of the entire Ethiopian treasury, the royal possessions of Ethiopia. It also was it was copied, and there are various Ethiopic forms of the original painting. And it only emerged later, much later, largely through the research of Richard Pankhurst himself, that the painting was originally a much older painting, going back to perhaps the early Renaissance, probably painted sometime in the 15th century, perhaps early 16th century, so that somehow found its way out to Ethiopia, probably through the connection with the Portuguese, because the Portuguese had close links with Ethiopia between 1520 and 1633, when the Portuguese were ejected from Ethiopia. And it mysteriously disappeared. And it appears to have disappeared from the hut, from the bedchamber of the Emperor Theodros, Emperor of Ethiopia, who was defeated at Magdala. And anyway, it disappeared. And many, many years later, it suddenly reappeared. And we know it was the original Kurata Resu, because you only have to look at the Ethiopic copies and you can see how directly they are inspired by this original painting. And it turned out to be in the possession of none other than the person I mentioned before, Richard Holmes, who had been the British Museum's representative on the Napier expedition. And what we must assume is that somehow or other, we know that he was one of the first people to enter the fortress after its capitulation, and he must have gone round very quickly. He might have discovered the Emperor's chamber, he might have seen the painting. It was not very big, small enough for him to put inside his rucksack or whatever and spirit away to England. And many, many years later, in 1905, it turned out to be in his possession because he was about to retire. He was incidentally, a most extraordinary thing this, but after he left Ethiopia, he stayed on the British, in the employ of the British Museum for another 2 years, and then he left, and he took up an appointment as Queen Victoria's librarian at Windsor Castle. Now, I say there's an irony here, because not long after Magdala, after the period of confusion in which another emperor was to emerge, that emperor was Johannes IV, who was originally the ruler of the northern Tigray province, and who gave great assistance to General Napier in allowing him to pass through his territory, providing forage for the mules and everything, and being very helpful indeed. And he wrote personally in 1872, after he'd been crowned, I believe, in 1872, he wrote to Queen Victoria saying that he would very much like to have the painting back, along with one or two other things that he knew had been taken from Magdala. One of the things that he also asked for was a copy of the Kevra Nagast, which was found and duly returned. But he also specifically asked for this painting at the very time when Holmes, who was apparently a very close associate, a confidant, and very close to the British royal family, must have known about this, but he kept his mouth shut. And suddenly, many years later, jump forward from 1872 to 1905, we find the Kurata Resu was in the possession all along of Richard Holmes. And in 1905, Richard Holmes, a year before his retirement from his post as librarian, Royal Librarian at Windsor Castle, he announced that he had in his private possession a very interesting painting. And it was published in the Burlington Art Magazine, the Burlington Magazine for Art Connoisseurs, and the article, although anonymous, appears probably to have been written by Richard Holmes himself, because Richard Holmes was a member of the consultative committee of the Burlington Art Magazine. And most interestingly, the article includes a photograph of the original Kurata Resu. And it makes it very, first of all, there is no doubt whatsoever that it is the original Kurata Resu, because we have only to compare the original photograph in 1905 with copies of the Kurata Resu, Ethiopian copies. And for instance, in this book, this book contains an illustration of one of the many Ethiopian copies of the Kurata Resu. And here we have it. This is a wooden triptych with a centerpiece comprising the Kurata Resu. And if you look at the various features, if you look at the fleur-de-lis patterns at the top and on either side of Christ's head, if you look at the shape of the hands and the way they are positioned, if you look at the cord that attaches the cloak, if you look at the blood trickling down his forehead, there can be no doubt whatsoever that they were copies of the original painting. This one probably dates from the 17th century, but it's a fairly typical example of many of this genre of art. And so, anyway, back to Holmes. Holmes, I believe, might have arranged for an article about the Kurata Resu to be placed in this magazine because he wanted to make money out of it. He wanted to he didn't actually earn very much money while in the employ of Queen Victoria at Windsor Castle, and was looking forward to boost his retirement income, perhaps. Another point of interest is that Richard Holmes actually first announced his ownership of it back in 1890. This year is significant because it's a year after Johannes IV, who had originally requested the painting from Queen Victoria. He died in battle against the dervishes in 1889. And then with his death, we may conjecture that Holmes felt free to talk and to exploit his possession of the Kurata Resu.
So there's a historical paper trail.
Yes, so that's right, exactly. Yes, there's a historical paper trail. And the story continues. Holmes, I think he died at about 1910. And shortly afterwards, his widow put the Kurata Resu up for auction in either Sotheby's or Christie's, I can't remember which. But one of those two eminent auction houses. And I believe it fetched something like £410. And it was purchased anonymously. Although we happen to know that the research of Richard Pankhurst has revealed the full story, and I can recommend you to read his writing. It's really quite gripping stuff. Anyway, that certain anonymous purchaser was a certain Mr. Reed of Wimbledon. And we know this because in 1951 the painting reappeared in auction, again at the same auction house, whether it was Christie's or Sotheby's, I'm not sure. I'd have to look it up. But anyway, it appeared. This time it fetched, I think, only £320. Yes, it devalued. Now, the interesting thing is that there was a certain lady whose name I forget. She had some kind of contacts with the Ethiopian embassy, and she alerted the Ethiopian embassy in 1951 to the sale of this, to this thing, and to this painting coming up in auction. But unfortunately, they were too late to bid. They were too late to bid, and it passed again anonymously to a purchaser who turned out to be a certain Dr. Santos, a Portuguese who was a Portuguese art historian. He was attached to Coimbra University, and he had known about this very painting from way back. He knew, he'd obviously known about this painting from the time even of Richard Holmes, and he was one of many, a few people, not many perhaps, a handful of art historians who, having read the original article in the Birmingham magazine, carried out an intellectual debate about the origins of this painting. And this is where all these various Renaissance painters that I've cited already come up, because their names appear: Adrian Nisenbrandt, Hans Memling, etc. And one of the people figuring in this debate was this certain Dr. Santos, who, back in the 1930s, I believe, had urged that it was not a Flemish painting, it was an Iberian painting. Probably the work of Bartholomew Bermejo. Anyway, he purchased it, and then the next thing happens. We move forward now to 1965, when Haile Selassie pays a visit to Portugal. I think I might have got the year wrong, but I think it was 1965. And Santos, the owner of the painting, suggests to the Portuguese government that they purchase the painting of him and present it to Haile Selassie as a gift. However, the Portuguese government declines. A number of possible reasons spring to mind. It might have been simply that he was asking too much money, or possibly if Santos was right, and that it was a Portuguese or a Spanish or an Iberian painting, it would therefore be a national treasure, a national work of art, and could not be exported anyway. Possibly. Who knows? However, nothing came of this. Instead, Haile Selassie was presented with a bound volume of C.F. Ray's book about Ethiopia.